Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Whispers in the Dark, brought to you by Super Horror Show. I'm your host, Eddy, and tonight I have a collection of terrifying tales that'll make your skin crawl and your heart race. Gather round and listen closely, because we're about to venture into the most terrifying place of all, reality, where twisted neighbors and sinister strangers lurk just beyond our locked doors. Are you ready to confront the darkness? Well then, sit back, grab your blanket, and let's dive into the abyss of terror with 4 horrifying encounters with creepy neighbors. Julia had recently moved into a rundown apartment building located in a bad part of town. She didn't have much choice at the time. The rent was affordable, but she was also very young. And let's be honest, young people think they can handle anything. This neighborhood was nothing to show off, but Julia was confident she could thrive anywhere. Little did she know that her life would take a bizarre turn when a strange man moved in just a few doors down from her. I'm sorry, did I say strange? I meant downright creepy. He was a tall, thin man. How thin? So thin his cheeks looked hollow, and his eyes were sunken in. Even worse, he would stare at her with those eyes, his mouth slightly opened as he breathed. It was upsetting. She could feel this ghoulish man's eyes trailing her, like a predator sizing up its prey. He also had a disgusting habit of leaving his curtains wide open, allowing anyone who dared to look a direct view into his living room. At first, Julia thought it was just some strange quirk. People have varying needs for privacy. It didn't take long for Julia and everyone else to notice that this wasn't an innocent oversight or a quirk. He definitely wanted people to be able to see into his house. And what a disturbing sight it was. Scattered across his living room floor was an assortment of inappropriate and grotesque adult toys and products. Yes, it wasn't just adult toys, and it wasn't just adult products. It was both. Some of them were completely foreign to Julia. The thought of him using these items in plain sight made her skin crawl. Both she and her neighbor started doing everything they could to avoid walking in front of the creepy man's window. One day there was a loud knock on her door. She hesitantly opened it to find a stern-faced police officer, his hands clutching 2 fistfuls of women's underwear. Her heart raced as he asked if any of the items belonged to her. To her horror, Julia recognized some of the garments as her own. Her stomach churned at the thought of this creepy neighbor stealing them from the laundry room and wearing them for his own perverse pleasure. Apparently, someone called the police to report him for endangering children by engaging in lewd acts within full view of his open window. The realization that he had been doing more than just displaying his twisted collection of sex toys sent a shiver down Julia's spine. As the officer led the creepy neighbor away in handcuffs, she felt relief. But in the end, Julia couldn't stay in that apartment. She moved out soon after. When Carter was 15 and in high school, his once peaceful neighborhood became the stage for a series of horrifying events that would haunt the residents for years to come. It all started with a woman who lived alone a few doors down. One night, she woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and as she walked past her living room, she heard the sound of her TV being on. Assuming she must have forgotten to turn it off, she entered the room, only to find a strange man seated on her couch, watching her TV. She was terrified, but at least her screams managed to send the intruder fleeing into the night. A week later, another horrifying incident took place, this time further down the street. A family with a young daughter lived in that house. The girl woke up in the dead of night to find her bedsheets pulled up and a man touching her feet. The moment she began screaming, the man vanished through her window. Not long after that, an elderly couple living 3 houses down experienced something similar. The husband randomly woke up at night to find a man standing over their bed, staring at his sleeping wife. He yelled at the intruder, who once again managed to make a quick escape. With the entire neighborhood on high alert, the police increased their patrols, and soon enough the man was identified. Flyers with his picture were distributed to every household, and the residents discovered that the man had been living in the woods behind their homes. It was a place where homeless people would often set up makeshift tents. But for Carter, the creepiest part of this whole thing unfolded one summer night at Carter's own home. It had been a hot day, so their sliding glass door was open, with only the screen door shut to let in the evening breeze. Their usually friendly dog suddenly sprang to his feet, growling viciously. His hair stood on end, and his tail stiffened. Something was not right. Alarmed, Carter's father switched on the backyard floodlights, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. The following morning, as they tended to the yard, they discovered that the lock on their back gate had been forcibly broken. Someone had tried to break in. If not for their dog, there's a good chance that the same intruder that had been terrorizing their neighbors would have entered their house. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood remained on edge, worried that the crazy man would return. Carter and his family were forever grateful to their loyal dog, who had undoubtedly protected them from becoming the next victims of this disturbing and frightening series of events. Years ago, Angelo lived in an upscale apartment complex. On his floor, most of the residents were well-dressed 30-something-year-old professionals. One day he arrived home from work in the early hours of the morning, around 5 a.m., only to find police officers waiting outside his door. The officers asked if they could question him. Angelo said that would be fine and invited them in, and prepared some breakfast for them. They began asking him about his neighbor, who lived just across the hall. They wanted to know if he'd noticed anything strange or out of the ordinary. Angelo hadn't. He told the officers the neighbor seemed like an ordinary, well-put-together businessman, much like the other people on his floor. The officers then revealed the chilling reason for their visit. A 30-year-old woman went missing, and her last known location was this building. Security cameras saw her coming in with Angelo's neighbor, but never saw her leave. With Angelo's permission, the police stayed in his apartment, watching his neighbor's door until they were able to get a warrant signed by a judge later that day. When they finally got in, they discovered a missing shower curtain and golf clubs scattered across the bedroom floor. The mysterious neighbor was quickly arrested. 3 weeks later, the missing woman's body was found in a wooded area about 45 minutes south of the apartment complex. A runner had stumbled upon her remains, and while the state of her body was not publicly disclosed, the gruesome discovery shocked the local residents. As the investigation continued, more security footage was found, and a chilling detail emerged. The tape showed his neighbor leaving his apartment with a golf bag. But, as previously mentioned, all of his clubs were found in his bedroom. The horrifying implication was clear. The golf bag had been used to transport the woman's body out of the building. As the trial date approached, the neighbor claimed that the woman's death had been an accident, and in a panic, he tried to hide the evidence. He had a girlfriend and didn't want her to find out he went on a date with another woman. The events that unfolded in that apartment building left a lingering sense of unease. If not for the security cameras, he would have gotten away with it. I just want to add a quick note here. When I found this person's account, I knew immediately I had to put it in for Amy. While waiting for a premiere to start, I asked her what kind of horror story she would write, and we joked about horror stories starring in-laws. While this isn't exactly the story we jokingly spoke of, this one did remind me of our conversation. Regina's in-laws live across the country. They have a neighbor that we'll call Bob. He's an older man living alone in their small community, and for some reason, he's considered a funny, dirty old man. You see, Bob has a habit of making inappropriate jokes about women's bodies, and his lewd, at times disgusting behavior is oddly tolerated by his neighbors. Regina could never understand why, but she and her husband would let it slide because they only saw him once a year, and her husband's parents had limited friends in their small community. When Regina and her husband had their daughter, they started keeping a closer eye on Bob during their visits, as they didn't want his crude language around their child. When their daughter was an infant, Bob made a very strange remark about her being a beautiful, naked woman while they carried her from the bath. Regina tried to dismiss it as a poorly timed joke, but it left her feeling uneasy and disgusted. As their daughter approached her second birthday, Bob crossed another line when he told her she had sexy eyes. Regina and her husband immediately recognized the inappropriateness of his comment. They confronted her husband's parents, explaining their concerns about Bob's behavior, and let them know in no uncertain terms that they didn't want him around their daughter, or them anymore. The in-laws tried to downplay the incident as another one of Bob's jokes, but Regina and her husband stood firm in their decision. A few months later, the in-laws brought up the incident again and asked him to cut Bob some slack. Regina and her husband stood firm, They reiterated their concerns and their decision to keep their daughter away from Bob. However, 6 months after that conversation, Regina's in-laws surprised them during a FaceTime call by having Bob present in their living room, attempting to interact with their daughter. Regina and her husband were furious at this blend of undermining and harassment his parents engaged in. They ended the call, and Regina's husband confronted his parents about their blatant disregard for their parenting decisions. After some reflection and further discussion, they tried to consider the matter resolved, but the trust between them and the in-laws had been damaged. They still maintain regular contact with their husband's parents, but the thought of leaving their daughter alone with them, or allowing them to take her on vacation, is out of the question. Well, my dear listeners, we've reached the end of tonight's journey into the world of creepy neighbors. I hope you've enjoyed this selection of stories. Always remember that you are a cherished audience and are truly special. Thank you for allowing me to be your guide through tonight's collection of creepy neighbor accounts. Until we meet again, make sure your doors and windows are locked and the shades are closed, because you never know if a strange neighbor is watching. I hope you all sleep well tonight, but as you probably know, on this show, sweet dreams are not guaranteed. Good night.